Hey, what's happening, Jordan? Thanks for coming on today, man.
Hey, how am I doing? Good to see you.
I'm doing good, man. Doing good. I know this is gonna be fun because our prior guest Steve Fell was raving about you, singing your good graces. So I hope you live up to the expectations for everybody here.
To be fair, I sing Steve's praises everywhere I go, so the guy's amazing. He's
Well, it's
great.
fun, man. This will be a good follow up episode to some prior stuff regarding soccer tech, load management, but also just managing the international athlete in soccer. So this will be fun and good to have follow up on this. So before we jump into kind of the nitty gritty and what you and I want to talk about, could you provide some color to the group and let everybody know what your origin story was and how you ended up at U.S. Soccer?
Woo. Um, Man, to be honest, I've got a great kind of like starting story. So I think I've told this story before, but I was on I had a sports hernia. I wanted to be a soccer coach growing up, or be in college, play college soccer, but a sports hernia. And I stumbled upon a sports hernia article by Mike Boyle on strengthcoach.com. Right, great article back in the day. And I absolutely like didn't realize that strength and conditioning was a thing. Fell in love with it, and through the forum, I met Dave Tenney, and he actually offered me. I interviewed with Dave to get a internship with the Sounders right out of college, and unfortunately, as I was interviewing and going through the process, it turns out they needed somebody like 2 months before I graduated. So I, Dave was like, yeah, maybe apply again next year. I was absolutely fucking heartbroken. So 2 months into it, 2 months later, Dave calls me and says, hey, the guy we hired just didn't come to work. Like, are you still interested in coming in? So the guy disappeared, completely disappeared off the face of the earth, and nobody knows what happened to him. So that's how I got started in soccer. But I've done a lot of different things through the years, and worked with Darcy Norman on a couple different projects at Exos and some other things. And he let me know back in March of 2019 that they needed a sports scientist. So I promptly left the University of Notre Dame and joined up in, gosh, March of 2019. So I've been at U.S. Soccer now for a little over 5 years, which is kind of crazy. It's the longest yeah, you know how pro sports is. It's the longest I've been in one place ever, which is great.
I mean, that is the fascinating part. Is I think it's later in your career, maybe like middle to later, as you start getting established, you have the opportunities to be in one spot. But like you just alluded to early on, man, you're taking the opportunities where they come and trying to get your foothold in the space. So with you said it started in 2019. There's been a lot of good things that have happened since 2019 in the U.S. soccer, since missing the World Cup in 2018 and then qualifying and being part of 2022, which you were able to go to in Qatar. So really just curious on your overall perception and experience of what life was like in the Middle East during the 2022 World Cup.
It's surreal. I mean, honestly, we lived in we were at a hotel, the beautiful hotel. It felt a little bit surreal. It was like being on a movie set. Everybody was happy to see you. Everybody was there. We were convoyed from one location to the next. So I think it was really interesting to sort of see a side of the Middle East that was very polished. I wish that we would have had more opportunities to go out and just see a little more culture. Like we went to a souk, which is like an open market, but it was yeah, you're really excited. You think it's this old souk, and you show up, and it's actually you can tell that it was like basically a movie set that they put together for the World Cup. So that was an interesting perspective. But I think what kind of blew me away was everyone that I met that wasn't a Qatari. They were from all over the world. From Argentina, from people from Brazil, people from Africa. That was a really cool experience just to meet so many different people working in Qatar.
And did you have in those experiences beyond the soccer pitch, did you have any non-sport related or just favorite memories you had out there?
Oh man. I think my favorite memories that aren't sport related is really just the camaraderie that we've built with our men's staff. Honestly, of all the places that I've worked, I haven't met better people, made better friends, and suffered through more late nights and early loadouts in any job that I've ever done. So I think one of the things that people would be surprised is a good proportion of what we do is just logistics of getting equipment and people from one location to another. So, and it really, you have to be very diligent about that. So I think honestly, some of my favorite memories are like the 2 a.m. loadouts of everybody on staff is out there unloading the truck. It's like everybody from Greg Berhalter to our general manager to, our camera people, like everybody. It's a pretty cool experience. I think it's probably that is just getting to know a lot of people really well because you end up spending more time with them than you do your own family in a lot of cases.
That's refreshing to hear how you guys approach the equipment because experience in the NBA, right? You traveled with a semi, not a semi, but a large moving truck, and coming from the airport to the hotel at 2, 3 in the morning, that task was often left to solely the training and medical staff, right? So it's really cool to hear how you guys gathered, rallied around as a team, and just said even those little things are important, because in my experiences, coaches, players, media staff would, head up to the room as folks like myself and the rest of the health and performance staff would unload alongside the equipment team, whereas you guys are maybe it's a smaller in comparison, maybe smaller amount of equipment. I doubt it, given the large roster you guys have in comparison to the NBA. But I find that refreshing and cool to hear that was as a team, and I think that probably is a reflection of the leadership that you had as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was if you're able to, it's all hands on deck, and it really is a lot. I mean, we for really big tournaments, we typically have, 1.5 to 2 semi trailer trucks full of stuff. I mean, we travel with an entire performance center from gym equipment to treatment tables to everything that you would need in a performance center. Like it all comes with us all over the world. So it really ends up being a logistical miracle that we get everything done.
Could you briefly highlight, like, let's double click on that because I don't think those that are not familiar with your space, not familiar with my space, understand the magnitude of that. So could you just provide a little bit more color to what it's like to travel across the world and bring what you need with you?
Man, yeah. It's funny. Like aside from all the sports science and all the performance stuff I do, that really was a huge part of the job in the first 4 years. So, um, I mean, God, if you're in a performance center, look around, and we take almost everything with us. That's all I can really say. I mean, we have from a kind of a sports science strength conditioning perspective, we travel with everything from our monitoring equipment, sit and reach boxes, hip rotation devices that we need for testing, personal equipment, sports science like the GPS equipment. We use Unifit, and we travel with 1 to 3, depending on the terminal, with their kind of full wrap setups. Well, we carry, 1 to 3 power block setups with us. Um, we typically will run Kaiser bikes or different bikes for people to have performance zone. And I think what's really challenging about it is every single camp we've done has been different because we're dealing with different hotel spaces, different fields that we're training at, different needs, different how long we're there, what type of athlete we're going to have. Some might be more rehab perspective stuff. Some we don't. Sometimes we have more opportunities to do testing with our 1080s or any of the sprint testing we do. So it's um, every single camp is kind of this balance between trying to bring the most useful and efficient pieces of equipment. And it's like that for us. It's like that for the medical team. It's like that for the media team, for the coaching team. I mean, it really is. It's a lot of stuff. I love our equipment manager. He's an awesome dude, but on moving day, he gets he gets pretty stressed out. There's a lot of stuff.
That is a thing. That is, I've always viewed or had the perspective that those that take on the equipment managers or the equipment roles, they are a thankless job, but like without them, the ship does not sail.
No, and I really like Kyle's job as equipment manager. Kyle Robertson, awesome guy. Like he doesn't get enough kudos. Um, he really is responsible for getting stuff in and out of customs. It's a full different kind of job to do what he does, and he does it for the most part with by himself and a part-time assistant. So we also have to be very thoughtful about um, the number of people that we can take on these trips and what we can afford. I mean, it's expensive. Every person we bring is an added expense. Being a nonprofit.
Right. That's it. There's a lot to it. I didn't even consider. I mean, I'm aware, but didn't even consider the logistical challenge of the international. I mean, here primarily working in the States for myself, it's you pretty much only had to go to Mexico City or Canada, and that's really not that challenging in comparison of trying to go from the United States to Qatar.
Yeah,
Hey
Mexico
man,
City. That's
hey, but like you alluded to, bringing a lot of tech with you, equipment with you, resources with you, which kind of ties me into a big point I want to hit home with you, and really just see where this goes, because I think it's such a unique challenge, but also you and your team have done an amazing job at cultivating this topic. And that topic is, how do you manage the national team player when they're playing for both domestic and country? So really want to start with, players are coming from all over the world, from different times in their league to off season, in season, preseason, right? Whatever it may be, playing maybe a different position than they may be playing for the national team. So to kind of start this topic and start this conversation is, how do you effectively evaluate the current status of a player coming into a camp or a tournament?
Yeah. Um, Look, I think between our head of performance, Thirsty Norman, and the head of medical, Donnie, you know, one of the biggest things is just weekly check-ins with the clubs and the players, and really trying to make sure that we have a good understanding of just anything that's going on with them. So, we use tools. We use this P3 platform to kind of aggregate all the communication we have around athletes to try to get a better idea of where they're at. So, I think first and foremost, the most important thing is building relationships with the players and building relationships with the clubs. And I would say typically most clubs tend to be frustrated with national team organizations. I think uh, like national federations. I would say countries that do a really good job. The German Federation does a great job. The English Federation does a great job. Aside from that, I haven't heard great things from other federations. So when we started in 2019, um, we started our first year and we were really trying to get our feet under us because our entire staff was brand new. So I think the first couple of camps, we were just trying to understand how things worked. We started to hit a flow, and then 2020 happened, COVID happened, and we had a whole year. So we decided to start this player first initiative, and the idea was the the clubs and the countries are always at odds with what's best for them, right? We want players to play every minute, they want players to play every minute, and that doesn't always necessarily work for each other. So there's always these kind of challenges of how do you integrate players. So Steve and Greg, Steve Cashin and Greg had this idea of being player first. And the basic idea is we decided that we're going to do whatever is best for the player because ultimately that's the thing that we share in common, and it will help the player. It's going to help us. It's going to help the club. So we started with this player first idea, and it was reaching out to every club, talking about how we operate, how we want to operate, and just talking about everything from movement screening to testing to the nutrition stuff that we're doing. And the big part that I was part of was starting a data sharing program. So the idea was typically national teams, they'll get a PDF report in the beginning from the club that has some information about the player, and we'd end up sending a PDF report back at the end of it. We decided that if we were going to be put the player first, we always don't have all the information about the player that we need. So what we decided to do was be completely transparent from day one. So everything that we're doing in camp, every piece of data we collect, from our morning screens to the GPS data to some other data systems that we developed that I'll talk about. It goes on using Smartabase, that we call the club portal. So the clubs can log in at any point, look at what the players have done, what future training load projections are going to be, look at their wellness screens and some aspects of their medical information, and they can call the head of performance or call me or whoever and ask questions about how their players doing. And I think it ended up being it was a little bit of a headache at the time. I think we were a bit worried about the knock-on effects, but I think what we ultimately found were we were one of the first federations in the world that had this idea of complete transparency. And over time, with building the relationships with the clubs and the data transparency, we ended up getting a lot of trust from the clubs where at first they were really interested in our process, and then they saw that we were doing everything well. At the end of it, we really rarely got a question from clubs that worked with us because we built a lot of trust. And that was honestly, I think that was probably the first thing. It's just collecting, aggregating, and actualizing on information is the most important. And the most important information we end up getting is really the relationship with the player and the relationship with the club's medical performance and coaching staff. And I think we've done a really good job with that over the last 5 years.
I would agree. The reputation precedes you on it's. I mean, that's the word on the streets. Is you guys have done exactly that to help manage the national team athlete in conjunction with the needs of the domestic club. One thing you mentioned that I'm really keen to dive into, because I know this is your area of expertise, but relative to the data integration, right? We live in a world now where Everything is measurable. There's dozens and dozens of tech companies that you can employ within your systems. So really curious how you're tying in the data streams within your systems and process to support or innovate how you're managing the athlete.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I think like innovation is probably that's a bit of a loaded term. And I don't, I feel like I've just been an applied person. So I went from being a strength coach, realizing that we needed to learn data, to learning how to code and learning some statistics and machine learning stuff. Like, it was just helpful to solve the problem of that problem. Like, how do we take care of players? So I think, in that, one of the primary things that we end up getting from the clubs is GPS data. So collecting all of that GPS data. Well, I'll start here. In a perfect world, what we want to do is we want to know, what have they done? What are they going to do? And then over the course of that, is there any area for concern? So we amply named the whole kind of continuum training load tolerance. Like, what is that athlete's training load tolerance? And that includes things like acute trauma. But one of the big challenges is, first, we need to get data from the clubs um, that are using multiple different GPS systems, different tracking systems. Some use Opta, some use TrackCab, some use Connexon, some use WeMove, Catapult, Stat Sports. A couple clubs have some custom things. Then there's even more clubs that are systems that are coming online that are really awesome, like Sportable, absolutely fantastic, really interesting company. Player Data also has some really interesting tech. So I think this whole world of all these different GPS metrics is huge. And then you run into the problem of, we use 9 key metrics that we use to like generally look at the idea of training for our players. But, we might have high speed running. A different club is using high speed running, but it's at a different threshold. So I can't really use their numbers for ours. So one of the first things we had to do was build a system that we could take and kind of aggregate the club data and really understand what metric thresholds they were doing, what can we match up, what can we compare apples to apples, what can't we compare apples to apples to. And then we use some machine learning, essentially using a couple different models. But the idea would be, if of the 9 metrics that we use, if the club only uses 5 of the same, then what I would do I would build a model based on our data to predict the missing 4 metrics. So then we kind of can fill the whole lot of the data that's missing with some different models that we build. So that's kind of the first thing, is aggregating and getting all the club data in. And I spent a lot of sleepless nights the first 3 or 4 nights of camp, like getting all that stuff together. So that was kind of the first thing. The second thing then is, we needed a really good way to be able to predict what the training load of the camp is going to be. So over the course, and mostly in 2020, I built a system essentially that we have all of our drills for the last, the whole year. So we have number of players, the field size, the rules. Like, you think of the constraint of a drill, we have it tagged in the database. So what I did then was build a tool, which we call the Camp Builder, that allows us to build drill by drill, rep by rep, for every athlete, and predict what training load they're going to get. And the way that we did it was, and one of the problems is, we had at the time, our pool's a little smaller. We had 140 players that we kind of considered potential players to bring in. So I might have a player's data that comes in that was with us for 6 camps, and then I never see it again. New player comes in, I have no data on this player, so I have no idea what they would have done in previous drills. So we built a classification model that essentially would, once we start collecting data on the new player, it will essentially estimate what player from our past data is this player most likely like, use that historical data to build out a profile and build out predictions. So we build every drill, every training session, every game, and then it goes through this whole process. So now we have what they did, what they're going to do, and then we start doing some calculations on it. So we look at multiple different metrics. Like, actually, I'm going to pause there because that was a lot. Is that all tracking pretty well? I feel like I'm
No,
actually.
I love that you hit on. So I'm over here taking notes, and I'm just writing down words that I want to piggyback on and double click. So I'm glad you hit pause there. For context, you and I are very familiar with a lot of tech, and you live in the world of sports science and performance training. In 1 to 2 sentences, could you just highlight what GPS data is and how it's useful?
I mean, honestly, the most basic thing is if you've ever, trained for a half marathon, right, or something. If you go from averaging 10 miles a week, right, for a couple months, and then you go and you do 20, 40 miles in a week, you're going to be absolutely, can I cuss on this?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you're going to be, you're going to be fucked, right? So like thinking about how we progress our loads from week to week is really all this is really about. So with GPS data or player tracking data, we don't just get total distance. We get the number of times they've accelerated, the number of times they've decelerated, how many meters of sprint distance, acceleration distance. I mean, if you look at these GPS systems, there's 700 metrics you can pick from. So we picked a subset of those metrics that we feel like best reflects the different types of loading, different types of strain on the player's body, right? A good simple example would be sprint distance and high speed running distance is probably more relative to like hamstring, posterior chain kind of stuff, where deceleration work is going to be a little more loading on tendons, quads, that kind of thing, groins. So we try to pick these metrics that are reflective of like biological systems and that are specific to different movement metrics that players do.
Perfect. And then from there, right, there were some buzzwords that I think a lot of people are talking about, but I even myself don't fully grasp because we don't live in the world of tech and data like you do. So I'm gonna throw three words at you, and if you want to define them independently or go right at them and see how they're integrated, right? I'm gonna throw machine learning, modeling, and prediction.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Simplest thing is we think about statistics, right? Um, Everybody's sort of like average standard deviation. So we're basically taking historical data and we're trying to summarize it to understand what happened in a way that makes sense, right? That's your basic statistics. Machine learning is basically a way to use statistics to try to predict what is most likely going to be the outcome. Um, if you want a really, really good explanation of what machine learning is for like the layperson, there is a great YouTube series by Cassie. I'm going to mess up her name, but it's something like Cassie Kasparov. She does a really good job of, I'll send you the link. See, she does a really good job of explaining what machine learning is, how it works, and that's the best way to explain it. But essentially, machine learning is a way that we can use statistics and computers to find patterns in data that would be nearly impossible for a human to see.
I think
So in the case of,
no,
go ahead.
no, the word I want to stress right there, which I've come to appreciate, is the pattern recognition aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, like in a case of like, let's say that I have this pool of all this drill data, and you were a new player that comes in, right? I need to figure out which player are you most like across 700 different GPS metrics. So what we use a classification model, and what that does is it looks at the data you're collecting and it compares your data on these 700 different variables and says which group are you most like. That way we can use that then to say, as you go forward and do new activities we haven't seen you do before, we know with some statistical certainty that you're probably going to have numbers that are more close to these set of players than these set of players.
And over the years and in that time, I'm really curious. It's just from my own practicality because I've never experienced or been a part of a team that's doing it at the level that you guys are doing at. To the degree of certainty or accuracy, when you bring in that example of you had a player for 6 years, you no longer see him, and now or 6 camps, and now you bring in someone that you've never seen for a camp. The degree of certainty and accuracy, hindsight 2020, how close are you guys getting with those predictions or that classification model?
It really just depends. So I think if some patterns that we notice, I'll try to go simple example. So let's say that we're trying to predict a center midfielder, right? And for my non-soccer people, center midfielders are typically, well, in the center of the field, and they do a lot of this, a lot of. Now, you're going to have different players that have different characteristics. Some are going to be typically what we call like box-to-box players, where they just tend to run all day, and they're going to have movement patterns that are more akin to kind of running at moderate speeds for long distances. Then you might have guys like Tyler Adams that can do that, and he sprints and accelerates and decelerates, and he's absolutely the same, right? So if we basically said, hey, you're coming in for our team, you're a center midfielder, and I'm assuming that you would be the average of a center midfielder, that's not the case. I have to start to know a little bit about how you're playing. And then we can kind of decide, are you more like this box to box player, or are you more like this really explosive center midfielder archetype? And as we go through all the different positions, you're going to have a lot of different archetypes of players that the system would kind of pick up on. So, kind of lost them. I lost my thought. What was the question?
No, we were talking about how the reliability and validity
Yeah.
and
So,
I guess the mean of error when you come into the classification.
so I think what it really comes down to is like uh, most of our data from our center midfielders in that example would be box to box, right? So if you come in and you're a box to box player, the classification algorithm is going to be really good. If you're kind of you have a unique movement profile, then the error rate is going to be bigger. But the error rate is better than if we just applied a random position or a random guess based on what the team average or position should be. So the error rate really depends a lot on different things. Like for example, if we have um, like national team rookies coming, say MLS players that are younger, or an international player that is new to our system, the our prediction algorithms are usually pretty bad the first couple days. I shouldn't say that. They're have a higher error rate because those players they're anxious, they're moving around a lot more, they're sprinting when they don't need to be, they're trying to overwork. So I think there's just so many constraints that our goal isn't to be our goal is not to be accurate. It's to kind of help us face in the right direction to make the best set of choices we can with available data. And like ultimately, I think we're trying to make less wrong decisions than we are trying to make few right decisions. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair and valuable statement to make. I want to piggyback on the word prediction because you used it, and that is been a word that's been around for decades relative to injury prediction, right? Injury prevention versus injury prediction versus risk mitigation. But I also want to pivot on that and also ask, have you seen a prediction in the sense of, hey, we thought this player would be ready for this position, but in actuality, they're more fit for this position. So it's kind of a two-part question. Let's go first down the path of the injury side of things and say, hey, what is your perception and your experience on the phrase injury prediction?
Doesn't exist. I think the system is too complex to like have an injury prediction. I think we were going to talk about this a little later, but for this very reason, I really started studying a lot of like decision stuff, and I actually have been hopefully going to be doing a PhD here very shortly, which I can talk more about later. But the idea is like I have a set of players. Like I can't predict who's going to be injured. What I can probably say is I have this set of players that I feel more confident that they would be better than this set of players, right? And I think being able just to sort of stratify your own confidence about who's more robust and who's less robust helps you make better decisions. Because ultimately, like we have to play 11 players, right? And if we between some of the models that we have and the heuristics that we use and just clinical best judgment, we really just have to try to understand what areas are we the most confident in and what areas are we trying to protect players? It's kind of a cop out answer, but to be honest, I think it's impossible, especially in our scenario when like we might see a player twice a year, right? And we can't count on the quality of the data that we have. And that's where it comes down to building good relationships with the players and trusting what they say because they know their bodies very well and having good relationships with the clubs so that we can try to glean as much information as possible.
I don't think it's a cop out. I think it sheds light into the idea of not the idea to your practical experience and knowledge base, saying, hey, like we've built let's just go back into all the buzzwords that you've talked about and clearly have a very robust understanding of. You utilize machine learning, you utilize modeling, you've done prediction, you've done classification systems, you've aggregated all these data streams from not only your training camps, but I would imagine there's some integration of data streams with all the domestic clubs too. So you're getting access to all this information, and still at best you can't predict injury. And I would be shocked to find out if there's another team or organization that has a robust data set and integration system as y'all have built there to be able to confidently say, hey, we're at a 56% chance of injury risk today because of X, Y, and Z. I just don't think that is there. And to your point, we're dealing with complex humans, which are complex beings, in a sport of soccer that is a chaotic environment because you have 22 players on the field in a very large space. Like all of those factors play into the decision or the idea of injury prediction. Now, if we want to pivot here and maybe talk about a more isolated skill, such as a track sprinter or a baseball pitcher, when you have a very close skill, perhaps the probability of injury prediction increases. But I still would say, I would err on your expertise and background saying, I just don't know if we'll ever get there. And maybe we will with the boom of artificial intelligence and technology is growing and investments are growing, like some of the companies that you alluded to. But I tend to err on the side of, man, it's when you put a bunch of complex individuals in a chaotic environment in sport, that's a tough thing to predict.
It really is to actually predict it. Um, but I think there's areas that you can do. For us, when I say prediction, like we probably on average, if it's a drill we've done pretty consistently, we're probably 90% accurate on what the team average load will be for that drill, training session in, training session out. And like we can use that to be predictive, but when it comes to really trying to estimate prediction around injury rates, around to your point, complex people and complex scenarios, like it's you never know. But I think one of the things that to me the mental shift is moving from this idea of trying to use data to make decisions to recognizing that like we are in a world every day where we have to make complex decisions with a huge amount of uncertainty and we still make decisions. So instead of thinking about what does data provide us, it's more, I think, starting from what decisions can we make on a day-to-day basis and then aligning as a performance team, how do we actually come to making that decision? What information am I using? And then just iteratively upgrading the quality of the data that we're getting and like recognizing that like the real goal, I think, is to make less bad decisions ultimately, and learning how to bring those constraints in. And by the constraints, it's like this side and this side. I know I shouldn't do these things. If I operate here, I'm probably okay. And if every year, every season, we can kind of bring those constraints in, I think that's about the best we can do with the state of the data that we're collecting and the nature of working in professional sport.
For those that are listening, what Jordan was doing was just explaining with his hands here. It's like if we're super wide with all the constraints we have, and then like you said, each camp we bring our hands closer and closer together to narrow that window. Let's just say narrow that window of choice, narrow that window of probability. I think is a word you said in there. Would then probably most closely relate to the idea of injury prediction. Is that fair to say?
Still, I'm hesitant to even like get to this injury. Like I think it's a bit of a misnomer.
I agree. I
Um,
agree. But
yeah,
it is what sells and it is what is enticing to those that don't have your experience or maybe haven't been in the weeds as much as you have. So I just appreciate the honesty and transparency on that and just calling it what it is.
oh, of course, definitely. I think we'll get there eventually. I mean, looking at, some of the Hawkeye system, they're trying to look at joint angles during play. I think eventually we'll be able to collect enough data to bring those boundaries in pretty close, but we're just not there right now. And I think we still have to heavily rely on the well-developed gut instincts of practitioners that have been in the field for a long time. And I think there's a lot to say to that.
Okay, we're gonna this is a completely left field question here. How do you in a world that is so data centric, and we were catching up pre-show about people that are in and out of sports, how do you prove that worth of that experience you were just talking about when in this world there's such a crave to have data and numbers and to show the value of what you bring, right? Could you just speak upon that idea of what you
Yeah.
just said about leaning into the practitioners as well?
I think there's two challenges with this. I think first is we have a tendency to have outcome bias in sport, and by that, let's take a really simple example. Um, we have a player that we are trying to make a decision on trying to play. Right? And let's even say we have great data. We have fantastic data and we can make good decisions. So as a performance team, we're talking and we're like, all right, if we return this player full to play in these games, our system tells us that there is a 90% chance of success. There's only a 10% chance of injury over the next month, right? So we talk about that and we say, hey, okay, that's a risk that our performance team is okay with. We bring the player in. We say, hey, we think you're doing great. There's a 90% chance that you're going to do well. We say that to the coach. Coach is like great. Players like great. We're like great. I think one of the things that we kind of forget is it's a probability, right? It's a roll the dice. 9 times out of 10, that player is going to be okay. Player goes in, game 2, tears his ACL, re-tears an ACL, let's say. Okay, great. Just because that happened, it doesn't mean that we made the wrong choice. We hedged our bets, right? We said 9 out of 10 times it's not going to happen. That 1 out of 10 times is going to happen eventually. So then what happens then is we have the player that then is pissed off they tore their ACL and maybe starts to point the finger back at the medical and performance staff. And we're over here going, we still made the right decision. The coaching staff then, their key player is out and they go, oh, this fucking medical and performance staff. They don't know how to return players to play. So we're being evaluated on the probability of an outcome, not how good our judgment was of the probability of what's going on. So I think one of the most important things I've come to realize is as a medical and performance team, we need to make sure that the heuristics and the experience we have and the data we're collecting is all on the same page. Because if you think, for example, let's say at a medical, if you think there's a 40% chance of re-injury, and that's based on data and your own previous experience, as a strength coach, I might say there's only a 5% chance. If we're not aligned and if we're not understanding how we have such a big discrepancy in the difference of that opinion, it's really hard to communicate and manage expectations to the player and manage expectations to the management and coaching staff. So that's, I think, a really important thing is we cannot operate well on outcome bias. And because that's typically how coaches operate, I mean, think about it. I make this call, we win the game. Fuck yeah, I did it as a coach, right? So then there's confirmation bias. So every time we play this play or we do this thing, we win. And that's why in sport, there's the lucky side. There's all the, because there's so much uncertainty in the outcome that we have a tendency to have outcome bias. So, and have confirmation bias. And that is an innately human thing that no one can escape. So that's problem one. I think one of the biggest things to fix that. Oh, sorry. And then the other problem then is because that's the reality. Now, as a medical and performance team, I care about winning and I care about the player, but I also care about feeding my family. So then you get a lot of group politics, you get a lot of group transactional things that happen of who's trying to protect whose ass and how they're trying to do it. And eventually you can turn a performance team very toxic because nobody wants to get fired. So I think that's inherently one problem. And it all really stems from the fact that outcome bias is real. And I don't think a good majority of professional organizations are grading their medical and performance team based on the quality of their decision, not something they can't control, which is the outcome. So that's problem one. Problem two, I noticed in my career that I got brought in to be what's a good example? I worked for Oklahoma City Thunder back in 2013 and 14. When I started, we were using the Zephyr system. I basically got hired to run Zephyr. Zephyr, if you don't know, is a heart rate and an acceleration. The problem is it only takes a measurement 5 times a second, which is not a lot. A lot can happen in a second in sport. So it was not a good representation of the actual physical loads that players were under. But because I got hired in that, I'm not going to speak out and tell them how they picked a really bad technology because I want to keep my job. So I searched for ways to make sense of that data because somewhere innately I'm afraid that if I really say, hey, this isn't working, I'm basically invalidating the thing that's keeping getting me paid, which I think that's also a big challenge. And then I think we don't really have always had the support to use the data. I mean, in my opinion, like with the national team, we're using myself and another guy. It takes 2 of us to be able to really manage the GPS data live during training. And that it takes a lot. So to me, those are the big fundamental issues when we talk about trying to use data is instead of focusing on the actual quality of the decisions that need to get made and being based on how good the decision is, we're being based on the outcome. And secondly, we're more focused on the data than we are focused on improving the quality of the decision that was there. And we used to go through this. Kyle Skinner is a great strength coach at Notre Dame. We used to kind of play this game on occasion. It would be like, all right, if you had to train your team and all you had was a sled, like what would you do? So we would kind of go through these scenarios of like, how would you be a strength coach if you only had, these different pools? And I think that kind of stuff is important because we think the only way to do it is with the status quo. And there's a lot of ways to be a good athlete. Thanks for coming to my TED talk. That was a whole roundabout answer, but
No, 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 no. You hit on so many unspoken conversations, right? A lot of things that you just said are a lot of thoughts that individuals have or individuals are aware of. Let's just say that. And I think that's the struggle with the whole decision around. Let's keep on the topic of return to play, because it is a very complex decision. But when you try to throw data into it, you try to throw intuition to it, it becomes even more muddy. And I love your perspective on the outcome based versus, I guess what I'm thinking is like outcome versus process, right? And how do you
yeah,
effectively evaluate the process and evaluate the judgment as far as quality? So I love that as the solution. That's just the way my mind works as well. How do you, or what would be your recommendation or your advice or experience in evaluating the quality of that judgment or process?
work for good coaches and good management.
I wish it was that easy. That's easy. That's all right. Here we go. So fire the coach if he doesn't understand and move on from an owner. I got
I
it.
think that's the thing that's tough is like I have a friend and a colleague that super smart, brilliant guy. Um, got hired into to an organization recently that he thought he was going to be able to operate in this really high level way, and he got there and realized that it was just all fluff, and the coach is going to operate how he's going to operate, and he's on the hook for things that he doesn't have control of. And I guarantee you, everybody that's worked in pro sport has a similar story. I mean, I know I did. Um, so I think one of the biggest things is like, first, I think we have to recognize that this is the state of the industry in a lot of places. And especially when you're starting out and you don't have the fortitude to pick the job you're going to get. Like, I know I think as I was interviewing, I felt lucky just to get offered a contract. So it's like, okay, I'm going to take it. And I think just really resetting your mindset that like, there are ways you can do things to protect yourself and how you communicate, especially when you're starting and you don't have the opportunity to take a job that is the right fit with the management, is the right fit with the coaching staff, is the right fit with the medical staff. Like those opportunities are not very common, in my
I would agree, and it's like we'll kind of wrap this bit up about that space. But I think you're right, and your recommendations of quality over outcome are critically important. So I want to go back to kind of where you are the expert, and my initial curiosity, which wanted me to reach out, is when you have right. You did a great job outlining how you were evaluating the athletes as they come in and managing their training load over the before and after and during. Really just curious if you could just touch upon or speak upon how you are preparing the athletes that are coming from different starting points when everyone is on a 2 week timeline of trying to
thing.
prepare, or how could you speak upon that to shed some light
Yeah,
more from a practical side of things? So I'm really just curious where you're at with that.
yeah. So I think the first thing to kind of go back and touch on some of the analytics tools that we developed, and I think that will feed into how we're doing things. So I talked about we had 4 weeks of data. We have what they're going to do in the whole camp. And then we have a tool that we're calling our training load tolerance optimizer. And it's essentially a tool that we can select any day for an athlete and we can change the values, how many minutes they'll play, which drills they'll do, what will happen. And then to recalculate, we'll be able to kind of scenario plan. What happens if, let's be more common. Okay, let's say that we have a player that had an injury, was out for 2 weeks, and then has been training with his club for a week and has played one 45-minute game, right? We know that we're going to have a 10-day camp and we're going to have two games in that camp. The first game isn't isn't a super hard game for us. We know that player, maybe they can play the last 30. So we know, looking at what they've done, the story from the club, we know we have an opportunity to get them in, to ramp them up, and hopefully for them to play 90 minutes, in the second game, which is the more important game. Okay, so that's the scenario with this player. Um, we're collecting information from the clubs about the particular injury. We're collecting their loading information. We've built it all out. We know what drills they're going to do. And now just Darcy and I are looking at the training load projections. And now we can kind of play around. We can say, okay, what happens if this player does a regen day this day, does half the load on that day, does a normal match day, and then we do, like, how much are we going to need to do as a top up on the match day plus one? Right? And we can plug all those numbers in and feel very confident with some of the statistics that we're using to know that we're operating, again, within the confines of what we feel is acceptable. Um, and to be a little bit nerdy on that, it's kind of like with the whole acute chronic thing. I think from your experience, I'm sure, like, using that, there's some athletes that you'd be okay with a really big swing in training load, and some athletes that you would be probably a little more cautious of, older guys, that kind of thing. So one of the processes that Darcy and I had is going through all the players and trying to understand, what are we comfortable with pushing each guy at, and then how can we actualize that using this training load tolerance tool. So that's kind of the first thing, and that would be impossible if we didn't have the support and the understanding of our head coach. Because Darcy can go to Greg for the most part and say, hey, this guy can only do this on this day, that on that day. Greg will push back and say, well, I need him to go through this tactical thing and that tactical thing. And we'll go, okay, if we do that, then we need to take here, we can give you this here, and we work together to find a plan. Because ultimately, with the national team, our goal, more than anything, with our really elite players in short camps, is we just need them to come in, um, prepare to play, like recover from their games, recover from travel, prepare to play, and then have enough time to go through the tactical stuff we need them to go through, and then do something kind of quick and sharp on match day -1 to get their body ready. And that's kind of the flow of how we operate. And without those statistical tools that we use and that sort of hedging of our own like internal mental models and what different players can do, and without getting it all together, we're kind of guessing. But like Darcy and I kind of have this joke that if we had to go to court and argue after camp, did we do what was best for the player, and do we have a reason and a rationale that's best in class why we did it? We're okay. And Greg operates that way. That's how we try to operate, and I think that's ultimately how we try to manage these players as they come in and out of camp. So more practical stuff. That's kind of the data science, the sports science, and the coaching interaction. It's a lot of give and take with the coaches, and they're really awesome. Like we wouldn't be able to do any of this without Greg's plan, his flexibility and understanding of sports science techniques, and he really makes it pretty easy. Super smart, really diligent guy. Then for more like the other aspects, we have a fantastic medical team. We really do. So as we get players coming in, everything from treatments to manual therapy to massage to recovery modalities that we use. When we travel with, various different. We have a hyperbaric chamber that we travel with. We set up cold tubs. We set up float tanks. We set up cryotherapy. Usually offsite for those two. We have a really interesting tool called ShiftWave, which I've never experienced anything like it. It's a vibrating chair with some like guided meditation, but it uses these crazy vibrations to, originally it was developed to help soldiers with PTSD, and it does some really, really interesting things to the autonomic nervous system. I haven't seen anything that has affected someone's HRV as fast as this does. It's really interesting. So we try to use different pieces of tech, really try to optimize the travel, which is a big thing for the players, especially internationally. So we use a company called, oh God, they're going to kill me. I can't think of it. Um, oh, one biome. They have this kind of like circadian rhythm sleeping program with plus supplements, plus an eating program that helps people with circadian rhythm shifts as they come into camp. And our international, I use it every time we fly. It's really cool. So I think those are some of the tools we use, and I think just practically, like, let's like set up a week. So let's say players are traveling in on a Sunday. Monday would be what we call integration day. So depending on how much the players have played, what their travel's like, that first day is more kind of just get the travel out of the players' legs. We'll do everything from if guys need fitness, we'll do fitness that day. If they need to do just some basic possession work or a recovery session, we'll just get that done. Then the second day, we'll start to kind of ramp up a little bit. It'll be a heavy tactical day. And kind of work through our week. And typically our match day -1, match day -2s are all very similar. So uh, again, the big emphasis is always on the tactical preparation for the players. That's the biggest thing.
For context, I think we should have done this earlier, and I recognize this as we were talking. Could you just, what are the job titles of Darcy and Greg? Because you've used them on first name, and I know who they are, but for the
Oh yeah,
audience,
yeah. Okay,
who's Darcy and who's Greg?
so basically, I'll give you like our whole structure of our staff. So Greg Berhalter is our head coach, super sharp guy, and he's got a whole host of assistant coaches that he works with. Darcy Norman is the head of performance, so he's the head of like strength and conditioning and medical. Um, and then we have Donnie Fuller, which is the head of medical. And those are like our, Donnie's in charge of the medical team, Darcy's in charge of the strength and conditioning and sports science. And then I assist Darcy with.
So then, one thing that you have mentioned, and I'm aware of this current staff that you guys have, and I know it's been built up over years, but where did the high buy-in and trust factor come between coach, medical, and performance? Because oftentimes, a lot of sporting organizations have the talent available, but it's the integration and the collaboration that is often the missing piece. How did
Absolutely.
you guys how did you guys get to where you are? Because I think that's so critical to the success that y'all have had over the last several years.
Yeah. We were really lucky. Steve Passion, who was the former Cycles head of performance, was with Greg at Columbus for 4 or 5 years, I think. So they had a previous relationship and a previous system and a lot of trust built up over those years. So Steve came with Greg for the guitar cycle. Darcy was his assistant, and I was the third assistant behind Darcy. Steve left, Darcy moved up, and I moved up. So I think we're really lucky that Steve Tashin did a lot of really hard work with Greg as his head of performance over those 4 years before him. And I think it also, says that Darcy has an incredible amount of experience. He won a World Cup with Germany. He was with Bayern Munich, and he was the head of performance high performance director for AS Roma. So he's a plethora of experience. And ultimately, I also have to give a lot of credit to Greg. Greg's really sharp. He really understands the whole continuum of performance really well, and he's the kind of guy that doesn't leave any stone unturned.
So then, what advice, like from your observations and what your own interactions, what advice do you have for teams or practitioners to try and even get to the level that you're at right now? From a collaboration perspective, excuse me.
From a collaboration perspective. I think first it's like recognizing. Actually, first I'll give a good shout out to a friend of mine, Brett Bartholomew. I think his work he's doing on. I actually, funny enough, I lived with Brett and his wife when I started working on Exos like many years ago. But I think Brett's work that he's doing in understanding influence and power dynamics and his courses, I'm doing a one-on-one mentorship course with him now, is really influential. And basically, I think I would start with recognizing as you step into an organization, who holds what type of influence in what way, and really understanding what types of influence tactics and negotiation tactics are useful against different archetypes of people, and just being really good at that stuff. I think everybody, when they start, we seem to be sports science and medical. I think we're the type of people that are enamored by the science and the X's and O's of what we do. And we slowly realize that most of that doesn't matter as much as just building relationships with people. So I think understanding that there are power dynamics, there are influence tactics that are used at every level, and understanding how to use those things and again, I think power dynamics has a very like Machiavellian kind of like feel to it, but it's really just understanding like I walk in and I realize that an assistant coach has the head coach's ear on these topics. So if I want to try to change the coach's mind, I don't need to change his mind. I need to change his assistant coaches, right? That's understanding how influence works. Then understanding who that assistant coach is, what do they value, what is their experience, how did they get there, where do they want to go, and then understanding how you can help that person get what they want. And I think ultimately, like, really understanding and building relationships with people and building good solid working relationships takes time, and you have to come in and you have to just go slow.
That's great advice. I can share the same sentiment of being caught up in the science early in your career. That's where you focus, and you don't recognize the value of those other two things you talked about as far as power influence as it relates to the collaboration piece. Because I think that's where you run into those folks that have been in sports for such a long time, and you wonder how, and you recognize, man, they're really good at slicing a room. They're really good at understanding those dynamics to be influential in the team to then be successful with what they do. They may not be the smartest person in the room. They may not be the most talented, but those people that can manage those components that you just referenced certainly add value to the group to be able to elevate the group as a whole.
I'll give a little anecdote if you want. I've experienced that with somebody like that. To this day, it was a master class. Um, so when I got hired on at Notre Dame, Duncan French brought me in to be the head of sports science. Great job. I was head strength coach for men's soccer, women's rowing, and then I helped kind of facilitate all the sports science initiatives. It was a really fun job. Duncan hired me, didn't tell me that he was leaving for the UFC job like a month after. As I got in, I recognized there were a lot of landmines in Notre Dame. This strength coach didn't like this person. I mean, just like it was very toxic. I mean, it was. I remember my first week, all the strength coaches were watching another strength coach a group, and I walked out, and it was like high school. Everybody just walked away from me. I quickly realized that nobody liked Duncan, and by proximity, they didn't like me. So I was like, okay, this is really tough. So then they ended up hiring Mike Zimborski. I think he was coming from Maryland, I think. But he came in as the head of Olympic strength conditioning. And for the first, like, I felt like 6 months, Mike didn't do anything. He was just friendly. He just watched. He was just building relationships with people. He was getting to know all the administrative. He didn't make a single change for what felt like it was at least a whole semester. And everybody was like, this guy's a dud. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't do this. And Mike and I started to build a relationship. He pulled me aside. He kind of told me what he was doing. He's like, I got to know where the landmines are. I have to know who has control over what. What can I say? What can't I say? Because if I started talking, I'm not going to be able to listen. And to this point, Mike was a good college strength coach, right? Like X's and O's, he was really good, but absolute masterclass in how he negotiated around everything. So one day we had this, the original weight room at Notre Dame was in the Goog complex, and it was this old kind of cramped, tiny little weight room in the basement. And when you walked in, there was like the Notre Dame Fighting Irish guy was right in the center of the room. And there was this culture that if you walked in and stepped on that, everybody had to do 50 burpees, right? And some of the strength coaches that were there that were more about, I think, punishment than they were about, I don't know, developing athletes. They like loved that. So we had this meeting in this room, and the first change Mike did, he sat everybody down. He reached down, and I can't remember if I'm embellishing this or not, but I seem to remember he pulled the fucking floor out of the ground, and he's like, "We're not doing this anymore. This is not who we are." And that was the first change he made. And over the course of the next year, he moved on 4 different strength coaches, set really good, clear expectations, changed the culture, and I was to this day, I will always remember Mike and how he did it because he did it slow. He understood what the landscape looked like, and then the changes that he made were really good. I really appreciate it.
That is a true masterclass, and I think not I think I can speak on practical experience as well as those times when you're in a new space, you're in a new culture, or just in personnel organization. Sometimes patience is required in order to do that, and I think a lot of us are doers in that space. And so when we're not doing, I can imagine sitting in your shoes, man, 6 months, this guy's not doing squat. He's not doing shit. Like I'm just looking over here, I'm busting my ass. And this guy's over here having coffee with the secretary of the third assistant coach. Right. And then you recognize like, oh man, like this was just trying to understand the people who had whose ears, what were the inner dynamics, and recognizing to that. I mean, I hope you didn't embellish that story because I'm just picturing you as you're telling this story. I'm just vivid, like, oh, this big strength coach comes in here, he's ripping the floor off, just like ripping the floor off. So I love the visual of that, and even if it was embellished, I'm still going to take that story home with me because that's fantastic.
Please do. Let's add the legend that is Mike Zimborski. He's an awesome guy.
So hey man, earlier you had referenced you're pursuing a PhD, which is no feat, no short, no excuse me, no small task. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. No small task. And you're embarking on it in a way that is a multi-tiered level to it, right? Where it's not just, hey, I'm going to pursue this one topic, right? So can you highlight what it is you're pursuing, why, and what it entails?
Yeah. I'll start with the why. Um, I think I've always been really curious about sort of this whole topic of like heuristics and biases, confirmation bias, some of the stuff that we were talking about before. And it's been a topic of fascination for me and Darcy. I mean, I feel like Darcy and I talk about it. To start, I've known Darcy since 2010, so he's been a friend and a mentor for me for my whole career. And this is a topic that him and I have always really enjoyed. But all that aside, I've just been blown away by. I think I have a very like scientific, logical mind, and I've been blown away by like people that have been in successful positions that like they're just telling the coach what the coach wants to hear, and they're really just navigating this sort of um, the social dynamics more than they are the science. So I think I was kind of blown away by that, and I tried to really understand it. So the more that I started to understand the industry and started to understand sort of this emphasis on we're being judged on our outcomes, on our processes, um, it's something that I wanted to study. So my hope was to do a PhD that kind of really dives into this particular topic of how do we make decisions under uncertainty, and is there a better way, a system that we can use to improve that? So I got really lucky that Rick Koss, he's the director of high performance for U.S. Soccer, so he's over all the different federation teams. Started developing a relationship with different universities, and one of those people was Tim Gavitt, which I think most people would know. He's a seminal researcher on acute chronic and awesome guy. Him and I were having a conversation about this, and it turns out they had a scholarship available. So I very quickly wrote a research proposal and got approved and actually got a full scholarship. I have no research experience, so right now I'm actually I got a full scholarship, but I actually haven't got accepted into the program yet. So I'm trying to figure out how to get into the program, but we're working in the right direction. So, but the research is a really cool program out of the University of Southern Queensland, and I have to do 3 research papers and a thesis in the defense. So what I'm going to do is probably going to do is the first paper will be I'm going to pick probably the NWSL and the MLS, and I'm going to do a landscape of what decisions do practitioners make in high performance departments, medical, sports science. What decisions do they make on a daily and a weekly basis, right? I need to paint the landscape of what decisions are made. How do they make them? How are they communicated? And how are they evaluated? Are there any systems that teams use to make decisions? So I need to understand what the landscape is. The second thing is then looking at all of the decision research that's out there and trying to come up with a system that is implementable within high performance organizations to improve decision making. So I'm going to try to do something like maybe pick half the MLS teams and half the NWSL teams and do some type of education around the system, then with the hope of kind of just evaluating their perspective on the decision system over the course of the year. The third paper then is, okay, we understand the landscape. We have a system that hopefully works, or maybe it doesn't work, of how we improve decisions. And then ultimately it's how do we then communicate those decisions to coaching staffs, medical staffs, to management staffs. Um, what negotiation tactics do we use? What types of influence tactics do we use? And ultimately, I also want to really get the coach's perspective. Like, where do they feel like the challenges lie? Where's the disconnect? Um, with the hope of like, I really want to try to. It's probably too much. I think my PhD supervisor would probably tell me again it's too much. But that's at least a problem I want to solve, and I'll as I go through this process, I'll hopefully figure out what the solution is.
I hope you do, because I'd be really, really interested to hear what you find and learn. Because you're right, that is a real life practical problem that exists. That is a challenge for a lot of people in high performance spaces, and probably not even in sport too, right? Like I imagine in large corporations or large companies, when you have different departments trying to make a decision about what product to release or what adjustment to make and plan of care or whatever it may be. I don't think it just high performance exists in the world of sports. Like it definitely exists in the business space. It definitely exists in other industries. So I would imagine if you're trying to make a business, hint, hint, here you go with your PhD, you could live in the space of high performance advisement as you figure out these heuristics here, because I think it'll be incredibly valuable to multiple industries.
I really hope so. And I think like, you start reading, there's all these different books on like on these different topics. But there's all these little tricks, these little tools you can use. And I think ultimately, like I just want to raise more awareness on with practitioners on there are things that you can do. Like I think a tool that I really love is doing a pre-mortem and a pre-parade. So to go back to our scenario with that athlete, that we said there was a 10% chance of getting injured. So I think a really interesting pre-mortem pre-parade could be okay. We're going to have this player go back. He's agreed to it. The coaches agreed to it. We think it's a good idea. We still feel like there's a 10% chance of injury. All right, so let's go through this. If an injury happens, when and how will it happen? And the performance medical team will lay out if it goes wrong, where will it go wrong, right? If it goes well, how will it go well? And then we go through that month and we have our review of the decision making process. Now we go, okay, it went wrong. He got hurt. Did it go wrong where we thought it would go wrong? And if the answer is yes, and we were okay with that probability of that happening, like we still made the right decision. But if that player got hurt and we had no idea, we didn't even think that how he got hurt was a possibility, then we probably need to really reevaluate like what our decision process is, because we should at least understand where the risk factors are. And granted, of course, there's going to be chances where, you know, something crazy happens that is so unlikely. Like that's what I mean. But if if we had the amount of times that you can have contralateral um, injuries because of an ACL return to play, right? You have an ankle out that's bothering you, and we didn't recognize that as a possibility. Man, we probably didn't do a good job. And I think again, from protecting yourself and protecting the player, understanding where the actual risks are and getting in front of those and communicating those to management, to coaching, and to the player ultimately protects you. Because the more we can inform people about the decision process in a way that it's a collective group decision, hopefully it'll help the player better and it'll help us win and it'll help, prevent more outcome bias.
I think so. I love the notion of running through the scenarios to then evaluate your process and the quality of your decisions, because if you develop that understanding, hopefully it leads to further conversations or it leads to further practices to implement and still, or maybe you got to pivot on certain practices or processes that you may have. So I imagine that is where some of those, let's just call it think takes, may end up in the end.
I think so. Too, it's also hard. Like when is there really time to sit down and have a whiteboard session for an hour on, in the NBA it's a little easier. You've got less players, but you know, we have, in a club team setting, we've got in soccer, you've got, let's just say 30 players plus the second team plus potential academy players who come up. I mean, it's a lot of people, a lot of scenarios, and there's only a limited amount of time. So I think one of the things I want to try to explore is some of the solutions from business where there tends to be more time on these sort of like crock pot type decisions. What is actually applicable in pro sport?
And where do you think it? What do you think it is?
Um, that's why I need to do research. So I have no idea.
Fair enough. Hey man, let's You've been fantastic with and generous with your time. So I want to just wrap up here with a few questions and have a little fun with you too, because you've
Oh,
been in the space for a long time and have traveled some cool spots too. But before we wrap things up, two things that I always love to ask guests, especially someone like yourself who's been in multiple spaces, is right when you're trying to have success day in and day out, trying to achieve high performance, not only in your job, but in everyday life, right? It's not just about the big wins that we have at the end, it's also about finding our small wins. So for you, in the world of high performance, what is a small win and how do you help find those when you're getting beat down with wrong decisions or chaos or complex systems, right? Like how are you defining that small win?
I think it's probably different for every person, right? I mean, I think it really kind of, we do what we do for different drives. And for me, building relationships and learning things, those are my big drives. So I think like, I try to every camp we go in, and my situation affords a very interesting like do and review because we're in camp and we're out of camp. So I try to pick two or three athletes, and I try to pick one or two staff members, and I try to really prioritize developing a deeper relationship. So that for me, that's a small one, independent of injuries happen, injuries don't happen, we win, we lose. As long as I can get through and help improve and build that relationship with people, that feels like a small win to me. And then from a learning perspective, over the last 5 years, every camp I've had some type of initiative of a system that we developed or a new tool we wanted to use, and just trying to use that as a small. And to me, that's ultimately um, how I feel the most best about my job. But I think everybody's different, right? So it's understanding like, what drives you, and then finding a way to live your work life in a way that you are um, connecting with those drives.
I love that, man. And you're right. Everybody has a different way of defining it. That's why I love to ask the question because I'm always just
Right.
curious how you can how you can try and find yourself in an environment that may not be so easy to find yourself in. With the plethora of experience and knowledge that you have, especially coming from a data background and investing a lot of time there, but also early in your career being a true strength coach, right, and being exposed to a lot of different philosophies, interventions, right? This idea of upgrading health and performance, this idea like how can we all be a little bit better, right? If someone was looking to upgrade their own health and performance, what do you think they could do today?
Go to sleep. I I mean, all jokes aside, I think like I'll answer this in two ways. If you're working with athletes versus like working just for yourself, I think really prioritizing your own health and wellness is so important. I think over the last 4 years, and I don't mind like sharing a little bit, but all the travel, stress, the work, it really took a lot out of me. As for example, let's say that we had a 10-day camp. Um, those 3 or 4 days before we went into camp, I wasn't very present with my wife. And a week after, I was so exhausted, I wasn't really present. So the amount of time and our marriage went through a lot of really hard things. And I think it was me realizing that I couldn't show up for the people that I love unless I was really taking care of myself. And this last year, that's been a big journey for me is understanding that. So I think whatever that means to you, for me, it was, connecting with things that I love to do, really, really prioritizing my own sleep and recovery and not trying to do too much and really working on, I think for me, going to therapy and getting to why I felt the need to constantly every day be better, be better, be better, and really connecting with um, healthier motivations instead of some unhealthy ones was a big change for me. So, um, as a big roundabout answer, but I think like really prioritizing your own wellness if you want to show up for the people that you work for and show up for the people that you love. And then I think training athletes, I think it's kind of the same thing. It's can you really be mindful and be present to them and be with them when you're with them, not worried about all the other things you have going on. When you're with your athlete, be with that person and really try to connect with that person with who they are and how you're there to help them and build that relationship. And I think like all the X's and O's of the data stuff and all the cool tools and gadgets, like it's this is an industry that is connected with people for people to know people, and that's learning how to be present and be mindful to me is probably it's something that I've struggled with most of
That was wonderful, man. That was needed, refreshing to hear. I also appreciate the humility and vulnerability to just share some like your own experiences with that because the context is always important
Yeah,
to help illustrate some of that. So I just again I can appreciate and respect you opening up on that. And I think it's important for young coaches and young therapists and young trainers to hear that because we think about ourselves and our own career and recognize like, man, I got to learn more, I got to do more. There's 1,001 things to do. And then you talk to anyone that's been in this space long enough and probably similar to yourself is kind of going through a journey of like, shit, man, I've run myself ragged. And now the people that I care about most or the things I care about most are affected because I'm just constantly trying to get better, the growth mindset. And that's certainly something I struggle with, man. So like we'll have to have a beer one day and just talk more about that because I don't want to bore everybody with our stories or inner dialogues or inner narratives that we probably try to manage as best we can. But I just want to say thank you
that's good.
for being honest, man. I appreciate that.
To your point, like there's a reason that our profession has such high insurance, you know, and I think we don't talk about it enough. I think it's possible to do it, but you have to be really mindful to be present.
I agree. I agree. I struggle with that still. So we'll grab a beer one day. Um, and let's wrap up with a few fun things because I think people are always excited to work in sport, be a part of sport because some of the perks that come with it. And we can't not acknowledge some of the perks and things that we do enjoy. I mean, yes, we talk about the struggles and the challenges and the successes and failures that we have on the field, but also there's a lot of cool shit that we get exposed to and get to enjoy. So really curious, being a part of definitely a federation and U.S. soccer, like what was one of your favorite cities you traveled to?
Ooh, favorite cities I've traveled to. Man, so many. I think we were really lucky to see a lot of like crazy stuff. I think it's I favorite in a different way. Like I really enjoyed seeing some of the Caribbean cities and some of the Central American cities that just you would never go to. Like going to San Salvador and El Salvador, going to Kingston, Jamaica, going to um, uh, gosh, I can't even think of the name of the city we went to in Honduras. But like seeing some places, it really gives you a lot of perspective on like how great, you know, the U.S. is and a lot of things that we have. So I think that the perspective was fantastic. Some of the most fun cities we've been to, um, man, I don't even know where to start. Like Cologne, Germany was unbelievable. Such an interesting state. That's probably one of my favorites. We did a camp in, God, I can't remember the name top of my head. We were in the Swiss Alps for like 2 weeks, and I breathtakingly beautiful, absolutely wonderful. That was probably my favorite place.
I'm jealous. I've been meaning to get to Switzerland. I've heard nothing but good things, so I'm glad to hear it lives up to the hype. How about favorite stadium? Because that's always cool with the international scene too. What about your favorite stadium you've been a part of?
Absolutely nothing compares to playing in Mexico City against Mexico. It's amazing.
What makes it so special there?
The passion of the fans, the history between Mexico and U.S. soccer. Mexico City is actually a really cool city. Uh, yeah, it's amazing, and I think like there is nothing in my career that has felt as good as beating Mexico the number of times that we have. I love that.
I love that for you. Hey, one last one is, and no names needed, please. We love anonymity here. Favorite locker room moment that you've experienced?
Oh man. I got a great one. Well, one small one and then one absolutely hilarious one. Um, every time we circle up and we say, we do our pregame talk, Greg does a talk, Captain does a talk, and then we say USA. And I get chills. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I get chills every single time. Like representing your country and being in that locker room it's really amazing to represent something that is greater than yourself. And I think the guys that we have on the team and what we stand for is really what I think the U.S. is about. The unity, the club. Like it's awesome. We have guys from all these different ethnic and cultural. So being part of that's amazing. But my favorite funny memory. We had a chiropractor who's been with the team for 30 years, and we won Nations League. I think it was Nations League, like 3 years ago. Uh, he's in his 70s, and the guys were doing like a champagne slip and slide. And this individual decided that he was going to do it, but he went feet first and smashed his head. I mean, it was terrible. We had to take him to the hospital. That wasn't the part I liked. The next year, we won again. The guys were doing the champagne slip and slide again, And me and another strength coach, the guy got down on the floor and we grabbed this particular individual's ankles and we pulled him through the locker room when all the players were spraying champagne. Um, and just to like, I don't know, to be part of this guy that has been with the club for that long, to have this like really hilarious, redeeming moment of getting pulled through the locker room after winning, that was a really cool experience. My second favorite one was, I think, after he had a, you know what, I'm not going to say that story. I'm going to save it.
We'll catch up. We'll catch up on that one at a later time. Well, hey, Jordan, thank you for the intelligent conversation. Thank you for the humble moments and the vulnerable moments to just shed color to everything that you've been a part of and what you've experienced. And most importantly, just sharing so much advice and practical knowledge and experience that hopefully the listeners can walk away with and start improving their own practice, improve their own training, coaching, lifestyle, performance. I just really appreciate everything you had to say today. So without further ado, we'd love to point people in the right direction if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to learn more from you, follow your PhD journey. Where can people connect with you?
Man, I am not a social media guy, so LinkedIn, but I would say I'm rarely on. So find me on LinkedIn, and that's really the only social media presence I have professionally.
Perfect. Well, we'll add that into the show notes and the web post, and we'll make sure people can find you on LinkedIn, and hopefully that turns you into a little bit more of a reachable guy because you do have an incredible experience that people need to know more about because you do add a lot to this industry. So again, Jordan, thanks for coming on today, man, and we'll catch up soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. I'm really honored to be on. So, and thanks for the kind words.